Today, I'm reviewing the OneXPlayer F1 Pro, and this is a device, a handheld gaming device that starts at $1,339, okay? My model here is $1,439. That's very expensive, especially when you compare it to a much cheaper Steam Deck, the Asus ROG Ally, or even the Lenovo Legion Go. But you do get a OLED display and one of the fastest processors you can get in a handheld gaming console. But the device itself feels very good to hold. Super comfortable in the hand, the back grips just feel comfortable to hold. It's rounded off on the edges, which just fit nicely in my palm. Super light, like only 594 grams. Like it's not heavy when you compare it to something like the Legion Go, for example. And then you have a bunch of buttons on the front. So these control buttons, the X, Y, A, B buttons, feel very nice and clicky. I have zero complaints about them. The halo triggers are nice to use. They feel very responsive. You click them, you can definitely feel it. And the D-pad is also very nice, especially if you're playing games like Street Fighter. You have a couple of other buttons. I'm not gonna go through all of them, but I do wanna mention the OneXPlayer button over here. If you push the right one, it brings up its own personal keyboard so you can type stuff in. But if you long press it, it lights up orange. And this means you can use the left joystick to move the cursor around on the display. If I long press it again, you can no longer move the cursor. So it's just a nice way to navigate Windows, but I imagine most people are probably just gonna be touching it. You do have the F1 Pro logo light up in the bottom left-hand corner, and then you have the OneXPlayer logo light up on the bottom right. Obviously, you can disable the RGB if you wanna save a little bit more battery life. On the top, you do have a good amount of ports. So for example, a USB-A 3.2 port, USB 4, audio jack, your volume rocker, which is nice and clicky, and then your power button. Now this power button, I'm gonna nitpick a little bit, like obviously it turns it on and off and puts it to sleep, but I find it very unresponsive. Like it's so flat and there's no depth to it that it just doesn't feel like a button at all. And then on the bottom, you have a micro SD card slot and another USB 4.0 port. But the one thing that I absolutely love about the OneXPlayer F1 Pro is this display. We're talking about a 7-inch OLED display, and this thing is absolutely gorgeous. Like fantastic color gamut, good color accuracy. It gets insanely bright, like over 800 nits of brightness. Like most other handheld gaming devices, not all, but most of them are still IPS. And I know some of you prefer IPS, but you just get the best response time with an OLED display. The good news though is if you're sensitive to PWM flicker, this thing is an absolute monster. Like even if you reduce the brightness well below 50%, there's no PWM flicker that's going to affect you. Like they did a really good job of making sure this doesn't bother your eyes. Now my review unit is the 1439 model, so obviously it's coming with the HX370 CPU. It's using the integrated RX 890M internal GPU, then it's paired with 32 gigabytes of very fast memory and 2 terabytes of storage. So plenty of space to store all of your games. And the beauty thing is that this HX370 processor is gonna mop the floor with the Z1 Extreme that's inside of the Asus ROG Ally. Like this is a strictly laptop CPU being put inside of a smaller handheld gaming console. And single core clock speeds are going to be higher than most of the other devices that I've tested recently. Same holds true with multi-core speeds, but of course it's not going to be as fast as the HX370 CPU that you'd find in a regular laptop. Now look, this is a gaming console at the end of the day, but if you were to hook this up to, let's say, a docking station, it could totally be used as an everyday computer. Then you can just like take it off, bring it with you on the road and game wherever you are. And since we're talking about gaming, this RX 890M GPU is obviously a little bit better than the 790M last year, and it's a little bit better than the Z1 Extreme GPU performance. And the problem with this HX370 CPU is that it's just an expensive CPU overall. And because you have to kind of keep things conservative, you're never really taking advantage of it. For example, the average core clock speeds compared to the HP Ultrabook and the Asus ROG G16, with both share the exact same CPU, are extremely different, right? Just because you have a lot more cooling in these bigger laptops to really let this HX370 CPU shine. It just feels kind of wasted in such a small device like this. The temperatures are fantastic though, well below 80 degrees Celsius, which is exactly what I like to see for a device like this. As for fan noise, it does get quite loud. Like if you leave it on automatic and you crank it up to 30 watts, this thing will get closer to 60 decibels. Of course, you can tweak the fan profiles to whatever you like and get the fans all the way down below 40 if you want a quieter experience. Just note you're gonna take a performance hit. Now, I played a bunch of games on this. I played Wukong, for example, and this is a game you definitely have to enable FSR, or you're just not gonna get good frames per second at all. Settings will have to be low, but the good news is you can play it at 1920 by 1080. And at that resolution with FSR on, I was able to get 70 to 80 frames per second. Now, I've also been playing Path of Exile 2. I absolutely love this game, and this is kind of a demanding game, which is weird. I mean, it is early access, and you're gonna have to leave FSR on. You're gonna have to drop it down to 720p, put all the settings to low, and you'll get around 30 to 35 frames per second. Now, 30 is not a lot, but for an action RPG, it still feels fine enough to play. It's not like it's a first-person shooter, for example. Marvel Rivals, which I've also been playing, another great game, I'm getting about 60 FPS, which is pretty good for a new title. Obviously, this game is well optimized. It reminds me of Overwatch, and at 1080p with settings set to low, I was able to average around 60 frames per second. There were no drop frames. It felt smooth the entire time. Now, to test an older game like Cyberpunk 2077 using the Steam Deck profile, again, FSR on, you're looking at about 48 frames per second. But the good news is I can keep it at 1080p. The great thing about these smaller displays is that you can always drop it down to 720p and things will still look good just because the display is very small and the resolution is totally acceptable. Now, if you're playing Dirt 5, which is a racing game, I was able to get about 77 frames per second, which is actually quite impressive. Even though it's an older title, just the fact that it can do this is really, really cool. Now, the two speakers are on the bottom. They're not bad for bottom firing speakers. They don't sound as good as the Asus ROG Ally X, which have them on the front, but they do sound good enough. Now, to get in and upgrade your SSD, for example, you're taking off about 9 screws from the entire device. You gotta do it carefully and slowly, but it's actually quite easy to get into. You just need a really small Phillips head screwdriver. And once you're inside, I'm glad they actually made the internals match the entire device. I think that looks really cool. You have a massive fan over here and a 48.5 watt battery. Now, I've tested battery life on 30 watts because I like to play at full performance, and I'm getting about like an hour and 10 minutes before needing to charge. Obviously, if you drop this down to, let's say, 17 or 18 watts, you'll get better battery life, but it just depends on the game you're playing. Like if you're playing an older title, you can extend the battery life past 2 hours, not a problem. But if you're really trying to get the best performance as possible, expect 1 hour of use. But if you want to upgrade the NVMe SSD, you have to unscrew the fan like I did here. Just be careful of the cable because it's plugged into the motherboard. Then you have to remove the metal plate. And once you're in, you can see the system on chip. And then of course you have the full-size 2280 NVMe SSD. Now, this is a 2 terabyte NVMe SSD and actually gets good read and write speeds, but my suggestion is buy the smallest version, then just upgrade to something bigger down the road. I like the OneXPlayer F1 Pro. It's a really cool device, but the problem I have with it is I feel like you're paying extra for something you're not getting the full value in return, because this is using an HX370 CPU. This is one of the most powerful laptop processors you can get right now, and they're cramming it inside of a gaming handheld console, which obviously just can't take advantage of that full performance. So you're paying more for something that you're just not getting back in return. I love the OLED display. The software experience is still Windows 11 at the end of the day, and even though One X is doing its best to compensate some of that stuff by offering a quick widget menu to access some of your controls, it's still Windows 11. You know, at least with the Asus ROG Ally, it's gonna get SteamOS support at some time. You can install Linux on it and have a very similar experience, but $1339 is a lot to ask for this style of gaming handheld. Like if this thing was like $700-800, it'd be a totally different story. But for over $1,000, I feel like you're just better off buying something from last year. If you have any questions, let me know in the comment section down below. Like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you guys in the next one.